54-year-old actor and investor Jeremy Renner entered the luxury hotel he co-owns. "I'm sorry, sir. The hotel is full. Only guests are allowed inside," he was told. He didn't argue, took out his phone, and made a brief call. Everything changed in an instant. He didn't need a grand welcome. No red carpet, no attention. Just a key, a warm bed, and some peace and quiet before his investor meeting the next morning. He hadn't planned to attend personally, but when Jeremy Renner stepped through the revolving doors of the Oakmark Grand Hotel in Iowa, things didn't go as expected. He was wearing a plain t-shirt, an old jacket, comfortable sneakers, and a worn-out backpack. No assistant, no security, no crowd. Simple and quiet. Perhaps he had chosen to appear that way on purpose. At the front desk, a young clerk was chewing on the end of a pen and tapping the keyboard with acrylic nails. He looked up and gave a casual smile. He saw only someone trying to check into the hotel. Jeremy always spoke with a polite expression. "Renner, Jeremy Renner." The clerk wrote quickly, then he paused. His eyes widened, his lips thinned. "I don't see a reservation under that name." Jeremy smiled slightly. "They always reserve a suite for me?" The clerk's voice grew serious. "All our rooms are full. We can't accept guests without a confirmed reservation." The atmosphere changed in an instant. Jeremy looked at the plaque behind him. Oakmark Grand, a Renner property. His name wasn't just on the reservation list. It was written on the building's entrance. He said quietly, "I'm a guest," and then added, "I'm a partner in this hotel." The clerk blinked, as if he'd just heard a Hollywood star say he was the King of England. A skeptical smile appeared on the attendant's lips. "Are you the owner of Oakmark?" he asked sarcastically. Jeremy shook his head. "Please stay calm," the attendant said, taking the phone and bowing his head. "I'll need to call the manager. Please wait here." In the opposite corner of the lobby, a couple in golf shirts whispered something into the ear of a man sitting by the fireplace. The man looked away. Jeremy noticed. That familiar moment when people label you without knowing you, when their eyes say, "You're lying." Within seconds, a thin man with a crooked tie and a file in his hand emerged from the side door. His name tag read, "Assistant Manager Neil Dorrance." He glanced briefly at Jeremy and spoke with forced cheerfulness. "Good evening. Is there a problem with your reservation?" The clerk almost shouted, "He claims to be the owner of the hotel." Neil hesitated. Jeremy didn't take his eyes off him. "I'm not claiming to be," he said in a firm but calm voice. "I'm Jeremy Renner. You can find my name in all the investor reports and shareholder records. A suite was reserved in my name for tonight." Neil adjusted his glasses. "Just a moment, please." He turned around and whispered something into his walkie-talkie. Jeremy didn't move or raise his voice, but the atmosphere grew tense. At that moment, two security guards appeared. There was no physical threat, but their presence spoke volumes. One stood by the elevators, the other by the coffee bar. Jeremy waited, not looking away. He wasn't afraid. He was hiding his anger, but inside a fire was growing in his chest. It wasn't because he didn't recognize them. It was the assumption that he didn't belong there. He could have pulled out his ID from his wallet, shown his emails, property deeds, or photos from the opening 6 years ago. But he didn't. He stepped back silently, pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed a number. This wasn't about a room. This was about respect. And these people were going to learn it. Jeremy didn't turn around, bow his head, sigh, look at his watch, or put the phone on speaker. He just stood there by the marble column. The phone was in his hand. And he waited. The call lasted only 26 seconds. He didn't need to say much. His voice didn't rise. He just gave his name and location. "I'm being denied access to the property I co-own. This needs to be resolved immediately," he said. Then he began waiting in front of the reception desk. The attendant kept looking at the keyboard as if pressing a few more keys on the screen would make the situation change. A few moments later, Assistant Manager Neil returned with a file in his hand. He looked tense, but when he saw that Jeremy was still standing there calmly, his tone changed. "Mr. Renner," he said, emphasizing his last name this time, "I think there's been a small mix-up. We just need to verify some information." Jeremy interrupted him politely but firmly. "Verify it. I'm not going anywhere." Instead of responding to Jeremy, Neil glanced at security. The staff didn't know what to do. Apologize? Try to brush it off? Or wait for Jeremy to explode? None of the options seemed safe. Jeremy looked around. 3 women in the corner were whispering with their mouths covered. A young man was watching the scene with his laptop half open. The doorman wasn't saying welcome to anyone anymore. His eye caught the receptionist's movement. She was secretly checking her phone, probably looking for his name. He probably knew there would be no result, but he didn't give up trying. This scene was familiar to Jeremy. People thought they knew what power looked like. A leader wore a suit, an expensive watch, and came with bodyguards. A man with a tired face and a backpack on his back? Never. That's why they questioned him. They acted as if they hadn't seen him. And worst of all, it no longer surprised Jeremy. He had grown so accustomed to this treatment that he no longer was surprised. But this familiarity, it hurt. Suddenly an old memory came to mind. Years ago in another hotel in Milwaukee, he was 28 years old. He had just started working in production. He was wearing cheap shoes that were too big for his feet and a suit that didn't fit properly. Security had been following his every move. The only thing that saved him was the CFO, who was heading to an investor meeting, recognizing him and inviting him inside. And now, all these years later, he was still having to prove who he was in a building he co-owned. He had never forgotten that day. And now, 20 years later, he was still trying to prove who he was in a building with his name on it. He took a deep but quiet breath and glanced around the lobby. No apology had come yet, no clear explanation either. Only the ticking of the clock, people averting their eyes in a forced silence. Then the elevator bell rang. 2 men stepped out. One was wearing a gray suit and holding a file. The other was wearing the hotel's company uniform. Both had serious expressions on their faces and walked straight toward Jeremy. Jeremy recognized them immediately. Regional Vice President Brent Kessler and Regional Manager Carlos Reno. There was a hint of panic on their faces. Brent quickly approached Neil and nodded without saying a word. "Mr. Renner, we're very sorry. We just found out about the situation," said Brent. Carlos immediately interrupted. "We're taking care of everything right away." Neil tried to say something, but Brent's single glance silenced him. The female employee froze. Her eyes were wide open. She had suddenly realized who Jeremy was. Her face paled, and she took a step back. Carlos looked at his tablet and continued. "Your suite is ready as of 12 o'clock. Your driver will be dispatched in the morning. Your fruit platter and espresso order are waiting for you in your room." Jeremy simply nodded in thanks, but he was still watching. Now he wanted to see how everyone changed after recognizing him. Had their tone of voice changed? Their body language? He was observing how the atmosphere shifted when power entered the room. Because it's one thing for people to be disrespectful when they don't know you, but when they still do after getting to know you, that's a whole different matter. Carlos pulled Neil aside. His voice was low but firm. Brent pulled out his phone and gave direct instructions to HR about a protocol violation. The tension that had been directed at Jeremy just moments ago had now shifted completely. He was darting around the staff like a panic ball. But Jeremy didn't move. He didn't cross his arms. He didn't raise his head as if he had won a victory. He remained silent. Jeremy slowly and quietly walked back to the reception desk. He placed his phone on the counter. "I'm taking the suite on the 12th floor," he said in a calm tone. "Same arrangement? And please have someone check to make sure the room is clean." The receptionist tried to say something, but couldn't find the words. Jeremy didn't wait for her and turned to Brent. "Has the check-in been completed?" Brent opened his file and nodded. "Yes, just now. When you get on the elevator, you'll be given 2 key cards and an incident report. Understood?" "Understood." Brent continued. "A general briefing has been sent to all staff. The inspection team is ready. Disciplinary proceedings will begin tonight due to a protocol violation. Every employee will be recertified." Jeremy paused for a moment. Then he turned his gaze to the receptionist. The girl was biting her cheek, her nails tapping on the counter. Her rhythm had changed. She was no longer careless, but anxious. "I'll talk to her," Jeremy said in a clear tone. Brent cleared his throat. "Of course, sir. Human resources should be on standby." Carlos seemed about to add something, but Jeremy raised his hand slightly. "Not now. I need to rest first." He took the key cards, bowed his head in thanks, and headed toward the elevator. Whispers grew louder in the lobby. Some guests turned their heads to watch, others looked away, but no one said a word. Before the elevator doors closed, Jeremy saw Neil still standing by the reception desk, wiping the sweat from his forehead. When he opened the suite door on the 12th floor, a light scent of lemon and eucalyptus filled the air. The fruit plate was there. The espresso capsules were neatly arranged. On the table lay a hastily written note with their initials. Jeremy slowly walked around the room. He wasn't looking at the cleanliness, but at the details, the intention, the traces of care. Because this hotel wasn't an investment, it was a part of his story. He remembered the presentation he had given at a bank in Minnesota when he was 33. No one had believed him. They hadn't taken him seriously. They had offered him harsh terms without even opening the files he had submitted. They had given him a chance because they were almost certain he wouldn't succeed. But he had succeeded. He had succeeded. And now, nearly 20 years later, he was standing in one of the suites he had designed himself. But he still had to prove it. His phone vibrated, a message from his assistant. "Everything is under control. Do you want to make a statement to the media?" Jeremy hesitated. He could easily bring this incident into the public eye. One tweet, and everything would be on the front page. He could be on the morning news with an interview. But he didn't want that tonight. This wasn't a night for anger. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect, and about how respect is often more about assumptions than reality. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He clasped his hands together silently. Outside, life went on. Traffic roared on Grant Avenue, and the distant sound of a freight train could be heard. But inside the suite, there was still a heavy silence. Then the door knocked. Room service. A young attendant arrived. In his hand was an espresso, an apology note from the head chef, and a written offer to send a massage therapist if desired. Jeremy thanked him. He closed the door and sat down again. He took a sip of his espresso and turned back to the window. As he watched the lights shimmering over the city, he felt that something was beginning to change. Not just in this hotel, but within himself. At exactly 6 a.m., something would change. Jeremy Renner stepped out of the elevator that morning, this time not just as a guest, but as a partner in the company. He was wearing a dark gray, stylish, yet simple suit. His posture was clear. His steps were quiet but determined. The focus in his eyes was so intense that no one dared to approach him. The morning rush had begun in the lobby. Some were leaving early, others were grabbing their coffee and hurrying out. But the moment Jeremy appeared, everyone's movement slowed down. Conversations stopped. Even the sound of coffee from the barista in the corner ceased. Brent and Carlos were standing by the fireplace. 3 files and 2 cups of coffee, both untouched. They were clearly sleep-deprived. Jeremy nodded slightly and walked toward the small executive meeting room next to the reception desk. Brent followed closely behind. Carlos trailed after them. There were 3 people in the room: assistant manager Neil, receptionist Kayla Mendez, and a woman sitting at the front with a notepad who introduced herself only as Marta from the company. Jeremy didn't sit down. He stood silently at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest. No one spoke. The room was filled with a heavy silence. Finally, Jeremy spoke. His voice was low but clear. "Can you explain what happened last night from your perspective?" Kayla immediately bowed her head. Neil cleared his throat but couldn't say a word. Jeremy waited. After a long silence, Kayla spoke almost in a whisper. I didn't think he was that kind of person." Jeremy nodded slightly. "So you didn't expect someone like that to own this building, did you?" He finished the sentence for her. His voice was still calm, controlled. Kayla nodded, her expression betraying her guilt. Jeremy continued. "Did I treat you rudely?" Kayla shook her head silently. "Did I raise my voice?" "No," Kayla said. "Did I threaten anyone?" "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jeremy took a deep breath. He continued in a soft tone. "This isn't an execution meeting, but responsibility must be taken." Marta nodded. "I understand," she said. Carlos interjected. "Kayla will be temporarily removed from her receptionist position. She will be evaluated for another position until the certification process is complete. Neil is also being placed under administrative review." Jeremy nodded in agreement. Then he finally sat down and turned back to Kayla. How long have you been here? 4 months, Kayla said. In those 4 months, have you ever wondered who built this hotel? Who it came from? Kayla paused. I guess a company or a group of investors. Jeremy paused briefly. Then he asked in a serious tone, do you know how many properties I've built in this country? Kayla shook her head no. 17 hotels from Baltimore to Phoenix. Each one was meticulously designed, luxurious yet accessible. The focus has always been on people. Do you know why I started this brand? Because people always treated me like I was a shadow. He looked into her eyes. Now tell me, why do even the people who work for me act like they don't see me when I walk into my own lobby? There was no anger in the question, only exhaustion and honesty. Kayla wanted to sink into her chair. Neil bowed his head, his face bright red. Carlos took the floor. Today we are sending an internal memo to all Renner properties. Mandatory inclusivity training is beginning. No exceptions. Jeremy looked at him. I don't want this to be a formality. I don't want anyone to just recite a script. People need to understand what respect looks like when no one is watching. Brent spoke for the first time. We will make this happen. Jeremy stood up. The meeting was over. As Jeremy left the conference room, there was a stir in the lobby. Employees nodded slightly in greeting. Some stood up hurriedly, but Jeremy didn't look at any of them. Not yet, because what he cared about wasn't performance, it was change. And before leaving the hotel, he had one more conversation to have. This wasn't about human resources protocol. It wasn't about politics at all. Jeremy waited until the morning rush had died down, not to make a dramatic entrance, but to eliminate any possible excuses. There was no noise, no fake smiles, no ringing phones, just silence and time to face the truth. He spotted Kayla Mendez in the staff area behind the coffee bar. She was sitting alone at a small table. A half-eaten wild blueberry muffin was in front of her, and her phone was face down. She looked tired. Jeremy didn't send anyone else. He went in himself. Kayla suddenly stood up. She almost spilled her drink. Calm down, Jeremy said softly. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I just want to talk. Kayla cleared her throat. Yep, sir. Don't call me sir, Jeremy said gently. This isn't an interrogation. It's a conversation. Kayla nodded. She looked down at the floor. They didn't speak for a moment. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the low flicker of the lights on the ceiling could be heard. Then Jeremy spoke. Have you ever worked in a place where you felt small? Kayla blinked. She raised her head. Yes, most of the time. Jeremy asked without breaking eye contact. Tell me. Kayla hesitated, but then she sighed and shrugged her shoulders. I worked at a diner on the side of the I-80 freeway. I had to wear a paper hat. The cooks yelled at me every shift. Some customers never tipped, and some called me kid. I was 27, but most days I felt invisible. Jeremy leaned back. So, you know what it's like to be ignored. Kayla nodded slowly. Yes. Then, Jeremy said, help me understand. How could you look into my eyes last night and think I didn't belong here? Silence fell. But it wasn't an empty silence. Guilt was slowly taking hold. Kayla's voice cracked. I don't know. I didn't mean it like that. When you walked in, you looked like you were lost, or like you were waiting for someone. Her words hung there. Kayla didn't stop herself. The way she shook her head suggested she still couldn't quite accept that Jeremy might be one of the partners. But Jeremy didn't flinch. He just asked calmly, so, what do those kinds of people look like? Kayla couldn't answer. She looked away. Jeremy continued, that's the problem. People always have a picture in their heads. Clean cut, probably male, probably old. Definitely not someone like me, dressed casually, coming alone. And that image doesn't just stay in their heads, it influences their decisions. It determines their reactions, their reflexes. Kayla whispered, I'm sorry, I really am. I know it's not enough, but Jeremy shook his head slightly. This is a start, but I didn't come here to apologize. I'm not talking to you just because I'm your boss or to turn you into a cautionary tale. Just as I'm trying to see you as a person, I want you to see me that way too. Kayla froze for a moment. She was stunned. Jeremy continued, never breaking eye contact. I used to be just like you. I started out as a receptionist. I was mistaken for a janitor more times than I can count. I was greeted with words like sweetheart, honey, and sir. Every time I had to decide, do I fight back or do I just swallow it and move on? He took a deep breath. And when I finally sat at that management desk, I made a promise to myself. I would create fairer places for people like me. Places where people like you can grow and be valued. Kayla's eyes widened. She could barely breathe. Really? You were a receptionist? Jeremy smiled. In St. Paul, my first boss said, you speak very well, and put me on the night shift. That's where I started. Kayla almost smiled. This can't be real. Jeremy bowed his head. It has to be, and it has to become normal. Then he stood up. I don't expect you to be perfect, but I want you to be aware. Everyone who walks through the doors of this hotel, old, young, well-dressed, or plain, deserves respect. Start here, and let's not have moments like last night ever happen again. Kayla slowly stood up too. Her eyes were filled with tears. Thank you for talking to me. Really. Jeremy nodded once, and he left her there, exiting the lounge. But as he walked out, something felt lighter inside him, because the message had finally gotten through. The morning rhythm of the Oakmark Grand Hotel had returned to normal on the surface. Guests were dragging their suitcases across the polished floors. Cups clinked softly at the coffee bar, and a family nearby was asking about the zoo. On the surface, everything seemed to have returned to normal. But inside the management office, it was a completely different world. Brent stood at the window, watching the traffic in front of the hotel. Carlos was silently typing on his laptop, drafting an internal memo. HR manager Marta was reviewing the new hiring modules with a stone-faced expression. And in the middle of it all, Jeremy was carefully reviewing the personnel files in front of him. He wasn't angry, but he was paying close attention to every line. I'm not here to punish anyone, he said aloud, jotting down a note on the edge of a report. I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again. Carlos looked up. We're changing the hiring process for receptionists. It's not just about skills. Empathy, bias testing, and awareness of prejudice will also be included. Jeremy nodded in agreement. Good. He tapped his pen on the desk once. And put me on rotation starting next quarter. Brent raised his eyebrows. Are you going to be a mystery guest? Jeremy smiled slightly. Not a mystery, just someone acting like one of Carlos's team. My name won't be known. That's it. Brent grinned slightly. That will make a lot of people uncomfortable. Jeremy shook his head. Good. Let them be uncomfortable. Because the real face of this business isn't written in the rule book. It's about what you do when you think you're not being watched. He stood up, putting the papers in a folder. The new training program will be ready by Friday, and it will include story modules, not fake scenarios, real guest stories, real words, human words. Brent nodded. Got it. I'll take care of it. Jeremy left the office and walked toward the lobby. A new receptionist had taken her place. Jeremy stopped there. The employee made eye contact, as if he understood, and gave him a sincere smile. Jeremy nodded in return. He glanced around. Everything looked normal from the outside, but Jeremy could feel those small cracks, the cracks beginning to form in habits. Real change started like this. Not with press statements, not with public apologies, with quiet corrections. And those corrections, until they became habits, and then the silence would continue. Jeremy walked toward the elevator. He would go up, get his things, and leave quietly. His flight was in the afternoon. When the elevator stopped on the 12th floor, the doors opened. His footsteps left a soft sound on the carpet. The corridor still smelled of fresh sheets and a hint of lemon. The door to his suite was ajar. The cleaning staff must have just left. His bag was neatly packed, the zipper closed. His laptop was on the desk, the charger neatly wrapped. Everything was as it should be, almost, except for one detail. There was a note on the nightstand. It was folded, unsealed, a plain line notepad, and on it, neat handwriting. Jeremy opened the note. Mr. Renner, thank you for your kindness. Kayla will be fine. It wasn't an apology letter. It wasn't a company-approved statement written in corporate language. But that's exactly why. It meant so much more. Jeremy folded the note once more and put it in his bag. He felt that something had changed, something small but real. His car was waiting below. As he exited the lobby, the same attendant who had opened the door the previous night noticed him. This time, he opened the door with a determined stance. "Have a good trip, Mr. Renner," he said in a sincere tone. "We hope to see you again soon." Jeremy smiled slightly. "See you?" he said, and he got into the car. They drove away from the curb. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because he had left something behind, something heavier than his suitcase. The weight of being misunderstood, the silent but deep exhaustion of having to explain his worth. And in its place, perhaps a little more understanding, a little uncomfortable but necessary awareness, and for them, and for himself, growth. But there was still one sentence in Jeremy's mind. These words were not for the hotel, not just for Kayla or Neil. They were for everyone who had to prove they belonged throughout their lives. The road was quiet. The driver didn't speak. Nothing was playing on the radio, only the familiar sound of tires meeting asphalt and the occasional flickering of signal lights. Jeremy sat silently in the back seat. One hand was on his bag. The other held Kayla's note. He didn't read it again. But it was there, a small but powerful reminder that last night hadn't been in vain. He looked out the window. Rows of brick buildings, gas stations at the corners, faded repair shop and bakery signs, and the silent truth echoing within. Even if you've built everything, sometimes you still have to fight to be seen. He hadn't planned to be here this week, but maybe he was meant to be here all along. Not for the board meeting, not for business deals or investment tracking, to talk. Because the truth was, he wasn't surprised anymore. By people making decisions based on assumptions, by being categorized without question, being valued without even being looked in the face. He wasn't angry, but he was tired. Tired of having to explain it over and over again. Yes, this is me. Yes, I did it. Yes, I deserve to be here. But he wasn't suffering. And that was exactly what people didn't understand. Jeremy wasn't suffering. He was just carrying memories. And if they were carried correctly, memories could turn into tremendous power. When the airport signs began to appear, he thought of his youth. In a cheap apartment, wearing a worn-out uniform, working night shifts. Without makeup, nameless, just doing his job. But there was a belief inside him. One day he would build something no one could take away from him. And he had succeeded. But it wasn't enough, because people still looked at him and saw something else, something less, something more ordinary, something unfamiliar. So, what do you do when the world ignores you? You keep seeing yourself clearly. You don't apologize. You don't stray from your path. You walk through the door as if it had always been yours. Jeremy got out of the car. He took his bag. He just nodded to the driver. No words were needed. The terminal was crowded. Wheeling suitcases, coffee cups, announcements blaring from speakers, and he began to walk silently. He was almost invisible in the crowd, but there was something in his chest now. That moment in the hotel had turned into a mirror where everyone saw their own reflection. And mirrors, they don't lie. They show you who you truly are. He hoped Kayla would learn from that mirror. He hoped Neil would, he hoped Carlos and Brent would keep their promises. But if they didn't, it wouldn't matter. Because Jeremy was used to standing tall. Because honor wasn't a prize anyone gave him. It was a stance he never abandoned. And now for those who watched, those who listened, unnoticed, met with suspicion, Jeremy had one final word. You don't have to shout to be heard. All you need to do is know who you are and always act that way. Let them be uncomfortable. Let them learn. Let them wonder how they let you slip away. And when they finally see you, make sure they never forget it. If this story made you stop and think, or stirred something in your heart, share this voice. Share. Leave a comment. And subscribe to witness the stories of those who refuse to be ignored.